Alright, YouTube, this is a video regarding the Sochi Olympics, the terrorist so-called threat that's been going on. Apparently these Chechen groups from within Russia have been threatening to give, quote-unquote, a little surprise to people at the Olympics and so forth. We can guess what that probably means because, of course, these four female jihadis, the Black Widows as they're called, have been seen in around that area. They've found, various bombs, bomb-making equipment, weapons, things like that around there in their searches, their security sweeps around and near the site, which means that these groups are quite obviously actually preparing to do something. They wouldn't just leave that many materials lying around to be found if they didn't actually intend to use them, most likely. And these Chechen groups, and the Saudis openly have said this to Putin and to the Russians. The Saudis are the ones that control these Chechen groups. They're the ones, let's face it, that fund them, that train them, that arm them. Very little terrorism, so-called, in the world happens without the behest of the Saudi royal family. Of course, you remember Osama himself was a Saudi from one of their noble lineages. Saudi Arabia is really the cause of most of the problems in the Middle East. You look at some place like Turkey, and you see they're trying to join the EU constantly, and other than Tayyip and his failed administration, most of the people in Turkey have already liberalized. You don't see many jihadists coming from Turkey. You don't see them coming largely from Tunisia, certain North African locations, or Morocco. These places are largely stable. They have growing economies. The people there, they may be religious, they may be Muslim, but they don't really give a crap about the jihadists. They don't join jihadi groups. When you're talking about jihad, let us remember that 9/11, when it happened, was largely the responsibility. Most of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, or countries that Saudi Arabia directly co-opts and, again, funds and trains terrorists in, and exports madrasas to, where they radicalize the youth and turn them into jihadists. This is Saudi in nature. The Saudi Arabians are largely responsible. I think if you actually asked people in the intelligence services or in the government and you could get an honest answer, which you never will, I think they'd tell you that they really don't like the Saudi Arabians and they primarily tolerate them because they're afraid that they'll raise trouble. And of course, the Saudi Arabians, one of their largest partners is Israel. Again, Israel, specifically the Mossad, operates there all the time, and these groups exchange all sorts of goods. If any attack occurs on the Olympics, it will be because the Saudi Arabian royal family decided it was a good idea to do. And I think Putin could solve this quite easily by going on TV there and saying that any attack on the Olympics will result in the destruction of every village in Chechnya and immediate reprisals on Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons. Essentially the extermination of Mecca, the extermination of Medina, the extermination of Riyadh, and the extermination by fire and sword of every man, woman, and child in Chechnya. Because Chechnya is within Russia, although this would be considered genocidal, it'd be considered by most of the world evil, nobody's really going to be able to do anything about it because it's part of Russia, and any foreign troops trying to enter the area would result probably in a nuclear war, which is something the Western world doesn't want. Oddly, though, here's a different issue. At an Olympic venue, you're not going to see just Russians. There's going to be Russian security. There are going to be Russian people there because they live there to begin with. But remember, this is an Olympic venue. It draws athletes and individuals, tourists, and so forth from around the world. Any attack on the Sochi Olympics is going to result on people from dozens or maybe more nations dying. Immediate reprisals should be taken by all civilized nations against Arabia, specifically Saudi Arabia, which sponsors these terrorist movements, in the case of an attack. I think that it would be interesting to see if the Olympics were attacked, what the Western world would do. It could theoretically, at least temporarily, unite Russia and the United States under one banner of saying, fuck the Saudi Arabians, it's time for payback, which I think would be a good thing for the world. Personally, I think that if everyone from Cairo to Kabul was annexed forcibly and Mecca was nuked, it'd probably be a good thing for the world. And there are those who say, well, the Islamic extremists are being funded by Western governments. It's all false flag operations and so forth. Possibly, or at least I'm sure some of these attacks are. I will agree with you there. However, if you eliminate the jihadis, you no longer have the problem of the false flags because you've just destroyed everyone who would actually be willing to kill themselves, thinking they'd get 72 virgins in heaven, or however they justify their attacks. These are sick individuals that are living in Chechnya. They've been burning and bombing things for decades now. They're no different than the people in Saudi Arabia who fly planes into buildings or try to get their hands on dirty bombs or anything else. There's no difference between these groups of people. They're extremists. You don't see this problem in some Islamic nations. You don't see these people coming from Turkey or Tunisia and certain other Islamic nations or Morocco. So what is the difference? And this is what we should all ask and apply our logic to. What's the difference between the Turks, Tunisians, and Moroccans, where you almost never see jihad happening in these countries? What are the differences between them and people from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from Afghanistan, from Yemen, from Somalia, from places like this? The difference is the Saudis have been funding such groups. They like to surround themselves with neighbors who are extremists. They've been operating all throughout East Africa and other parts of Africa too. They operate in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They operate in Iraq. They don't really operate in Iran because Iran has its own backings that it has, Hezbollah and so forth, and in Lebanon and so forth. But these groups are largely funded by the Saudi Arabians. So if Putin wants to solve the issue, what he will do is simply come out and say Chechnya will be no longer alive, for the Kaaba will be rubble if any attack takes place on the Olympics. And trust me, they would think twice about attacking the Olympics if they thought there would be a nuclear strike on Mecca. It would wipe out their religion overnight. What you'd see is a flare-up of the extremists in that region. Then they would attack things, they would get killed, and eventually there would be no more extremists. Because the entire Western world, seeing the evil of Islam as it truly is, would wipe them off the face of the earth. All Muslims living outside of the civilized world would be dead, because they all would have taken up arms in retribution and been gunned down. These nations don't have nuclear weapons, other than Pakistan. Pakistan's more worried about India and China and fighting over the Kashmiri province. They don't give a shit. And the Muslims living in the Western world largely don't give a shit. And if they rise up again, kill them. What we need to do with Islamic extremism is take a much harder line. Because in the past, if a powerful nation experienced some sort of violent revolt, it put down the revolt by killing those that were attacking. It's a little more difficult with terrorism because it's kind of hard to differentiate who's actually shooting at you sometimes. Thus, the logical response is, if they do continue to attack the Western world, the Western civilized world, the United States, the EU, Russia, China, all of their various allies and vassal states, that involves all of Latin America, the Australians, the Japanese, the Koreans, Vietnam, the Laos, Cambodia, all of these groups, certain North African nations, specifically the Moroccans and Tunisians, the Turks, to a lesser extent, the Israelis, all of these groups, parts of Africa, all of these states should just team up and say enough is enough, we're going to have your heads and be done with it. Look at what Vlad the Impaler did. It was quite a good tactic, and had he not been outnumbered 10-1, he probably would have been successful. That's the line we need to take against Islamic extremism. And for those that are worried about, well, the Israelis are actually doing it, yeah, they probably are using Islamic extremists. But if all the Islamic extremists suddenly go bye-bye, that doesn't happen anymore. I don't know, they'd be funding anarchists in Latin America or something. Yeah, the Western powers do misuse the Islamic people. The difference is, the reason that this is happening is that at the behest of the Saudi government. The Saudi royal family grinds its own people down and continually abuses them. Meanwhile, it gets billions every year in oil surplus, in oil funds, and it exports most of that money, because it doesn't worry about its own people suffering. It exports a great deal of that money to training people in other countries. If you get rid of the Saudis, you've just taken out the keystone of terrorism. Of Islamic, you should just term it Islamic extremism. Terrorism is a loose blanket term that has lost all meaning since 9/11. Let's just call it what it is. A bunch of crazy Muslims who blow themselves up and constantly attack other countries. You see, the Middle East doesn't have nuclear weapons in it. The Israelis have nuclear weapons. The Saudis don't have them. The Iraqis don't have them. The Iranians don't have them, and let's face it, probably never will. You can bicker all day about how close they are to achieving nukes. They've been talking about how a few years from now they'll have nuclear weapons. They've been saying that since the 1980s, so it's never going to happen. The Syrians don't have nukes. The Yemenis, the Jordanians, none of these people have nuclear weapons. If the nuclear powers of the world decide that it's time to end Islamofascism, there's nothing they can do about it. They can all get together in one giant army numbering in the hundreds of millions and they'd get mowed down. A bullet wouldn't even need to be fired. Nuclear weapons would take care of it. Would this be genocidal and terrible? Yes, but look at these people and what they espouse. They're saying Islam will dominate the world. Islam for the West. Sharia for Britain. Sharia for Sweden. We're going to pour into your countries, rape your women, kill your children, and take over. These are genocidal individuals. And guess what? The Saudis sponsor every last one of them. So if Putin is smart, he will say this, that if the Sochi Olympics are attacked, he will retaliate, and he won't hold back. And the Western world should stand with him and do the same thing, because if the Sochi Olympics are attacked, there will be Americans dead, there will be dead French people, there will be dead Turks, there will be dead Japanese people, there will be dead Koreans, there will be dead Chinese, there will be dead people from South Africa and Brazil and Colombia and Mexico and every other nation on earth. There will be dead people from the Middle East, from countries that actually sponsored the terrorists that attacked in the first place. These people have absolutely no regard for human life, to the point at which they're willing to threaten to bomb an international event which is conducted in peacetime, which has no relation to geopolitics. It's a fucking sports game. It's a bunch of sports where the nations compete amicably so that they can solve their differences by pitting athletes against each other rather than shooting at each other. That's been in existence for over 2,000 years, since ancient Greece, and they're threatening to attack it. That screams, we want to take over the world and destroy you all and just raise chaos every which way we can. And the Saudis largely are responsible for all of these groups. And remember, the Saudis themselves told Putin and told the Russians, we control the Chechens. If you get this Syria peace accord done, then there won't be a problem. Trying to blackmail, in other words, or bribe, I guess you could say, the Russians. Well, there doesn't need to be any attacks. We control the Chechens completely. You get this peace accord passed, everything's hunky-dory. Well, the peace accord didn't pass. And now there are suicide bombers and bombs and weapons and so forth scattered around the Sochi Olympic site. There's a very real possibility that these groups really are crazy enough to attack this area during the Olympics. It's very possible that they will do so. They probably won't be able to get explosives into the site unless they have some black ops group working with them. Dare I say Mossad, hoping that the Middle East will end up getting clusterfucked afterwards. But even then, even if some shadowy group like the Mossad or the CIA or the KGB or something decided they wanted to false flag this and let the extremists detonate a dirty bomb or an anthrax explosive or something like that at the site, I still wouldn't have a problem with the Western world then going in and clusterfucking the Saudis. Because they raise so much trouble, they do it so continuously, and the royal family especially is genocidal and insane to begin with, that it wouldn't be a loss for the world. If we were to drop a bunker buster right on top of their palace complex and kill every member of the Saudi royal family, the world would be a lot more peaceful afterwards. And the Saudi people would probably be happy. Because suddenly, instead of the Saudi royal family gobbling up 99% of their country's productivity into one small family unit, there would actually be some level of progress in that country. Because they control a great deal of the world's oil, yet the average person in Saudi Arabia is still living in a mud brick hut without heating or air conditioning or refrigeration or electricity. They're living on the fringes of society around an oasis in the middle of fucking nowhere without paved roads. It's not a very progressive society, that's for sure. So I would stand with Putin if he decided to nuke Mecca. In fact, I'd say the United States should join in. Have a joint nuclear conference. have the Russians and the English and the French and so on, the Indians and the Chinese, and say, well, we should all just lob one small nuke into Mecca so that it'll be a big glorious explosion. We can film the whole thing. And then we can broadcast it on TV throughout the entire Middle East and say, this is what will happen if you attack us. Islamofascism would no longer exist. If these people are that crazy, that messed up, that they're willing to attack an international and peacetime event, they should be destroyed from off the face of the earth. And again, I'm not even a war hawk. I'm not saying march tanks into these areas. I'm saying simply destroy Mecca. I'm saying level Mecca into a smoldering crater so that they no longer have a center of worship and are completely cut off from their God for all eternity. And to the average Muslim in the Western world, or in the more civilized Islamic states, they wouldn't care. They don't even do Hajj. They don't pray 5 times a day. All they do is call themselves Muslims. They're like Unitarian Christians over here in the United States. They don't give a shit. They say, well, I believe in Allah, but all that Hajj stuff is just a bunch of bullshit. So, let them attack the Olympics and then see what Putin does. Because I bet that Putin has more balls than the Western world. And guess what? I think he would attack Chechnya and drive them out into the deserts. I think he would consider attacking Saudi Arabia. And if the United States stood in the way, I'd be sorely disappointed because, yeah, they're supposedly a U.S. ally. Guess what? They backed the 9/11 hijackers. They're no ally of ours. Anyone who thinks that the Saudis, of all people on the face of the earth, would ally with anyone else when they're a bunch of crazed racist nationalists to begin with, they don't care about you. They'll sell you oil, and at the same time, they'll put madrasas in your country to make sure that they can keep, sort of influence your affairs. If you do something they don't like, they can then attack civilian targets and kill thousands of people. So that's my idea for the Sochi Olympics. So if Putin, Putin obviously probably doesn't watch YouTube. But yeah, I think he has balls of steel, and I think above most world leaders, he'd actually be willing to do something about this if it happens. It would be amusing, beyond my wildest dreams, to see Mecca burn in a gigantic explosion, and to see Islamists around the world look on starstruck in awe as the Kaaba goes flying through the air and that little vagina meteorite that they worship goes flying 100 miles into the sea. It would be beautiful. Honestly, it would be quite beautiful. And best part is, because of the prevailing wind currents, none of that fallout would hit anything outside of Saudi Arabia, so consider it. Consider it as an idea if the Olympics are attacked.